Welcome to Mike fulfilling a couple of long overdue promises. Promise number one, I would get back into sword content. Promise number two, made, well, a good year ago now, in a video titled Wearing and Drawing Single Hanger Shin Gunto, was that I would do a follow-up video on two hanger swords, such as this Type 97 Shin Gunto, or yes, Tachi. And a viewer recently reminded me they were still waiting for it. And I apologize because, like my other sword content that I have planned, it all got pushed aside by the big move and I got focused on knife reviews. So I'm hoping that fulfilling promise number two today will give me a good nudge to get into full swing of fulfilling promise number one, sword content. But before we get to it, I have to dig up the old caveats. Caveat number one, I don't consider myself any kind of master expert, anything like that. And caveat number two, I never intend to contradict whatever you are being taught in whatever system you're studying training in. But if your system doesn't cover these topics, hopefully I can give you some useful information based on my own experience. Speaking of which, in the videos I've done on Shin Gunto so far, I mentioned that when I started training Japanese swordsmanship back in the 1970s, if you wanted a shinken, a live blade to train with, cut with, instead of a blunt iaito or a boken, the only decent thing on the market was a war prize. But if your system is built around the use of an uchigatana, well, there's some differences here that I had to adapt to. One is the Tachi-like design of the suka. Also, it's a bit shorter than a lot of uchigatana. And the sori, the curvature of the blade, might be different. But the third thing, especially when it comes to wearing and drawing the thing, is the adaptations I had to make to the different type of saya and its hanger. So refer back to that video on my misadventures regarding single hanger swords. What happens, though, when you add a second hanger? Let's go ahead and start with what I consider your most challenging option. Choosing to wear a sword like this edge up through your obi as if it were an uchigatana, and then training with it in something like iaido as if it was an uchigatana. And I'm going to start with your worst choice. A sword like this Shin Gunto that has metal ring hangers, like a Western saber. We'll get back to that topic shortly. Now I talked about how I worked around having one hanger like this. Now, I actually made it work for me just fine, but I did have a couple of challenges with it. Your biggest issue here, though, is that lower hanger. Starting with, well, let's say your art includes the ritual, smooth, graceful insertion of the sword into your obi, and then later, similar removal of it. Single hanger dropped right in. Double hanger, yeah, I've got to work that lower ashi through my obi. Now, one thing I'm going to say it actually does for you, whether you want it to or not, is it serves as kind of a hook here to keep your blade from accidentally coming out of the saya. And as I demonstrated in the single hanger video, you could tie your sageo, or in this case a tassel, to the top ashi ring and then secure it to your obi as your style dictates. But your problems come into play with the restriction that lower hanger is causing you. First, in linear sayabiki. If you are practicing a long sayabiki draw stroke where you start by really extending that saya forward from the belt, you'll notice I had to clear that hook to get it that far. What you're doing here is facilitating a very fast draw by basically pulling the saya off the blade versus pulling the blade out of the saya. However, now that I've unhooked it and freed it, I can do that. When I go to do that, yeah, that lower ashi is going to immediately hit the obi, and I'm not going to have arm length to draw the sword. So I've got to keep that lower ashi below the obi. That restricts how much I can do that. But with a blade of a nagasa length, similar to an uchigatana, We're talking 27, 28 inches, about 71 centimeters. Even with my short arms, it's not too much of a struggle. And also, when it comes to doing no-toe, yeah, I can position my hand on the koiguchi, so that's not really a problem either. But that was an edge-up draw. Second huge challenge happens if you are going to rotate the blade into a horizontal or rising cut. And often that is done starting with the edge up, and then partway through the draw you rotate the whole thing over. Now if I do that though, what happens is that lower ashi digs right into my hip and restricts how much I can turn this saya to, well, not quite horizontal. And if I'm not ready for that, what's going to happen is my blade is going to bind in the saya, potentially damaging the saya, potentially catastrophically, might even damage the blade. So I'm going to say not recommended for most Iaido practice. What about a Tachi? Trying to wear a Tachi edge up through the obi as if it were an uchigatana. Well, first of all, I have to qualify something. If you're getting a Tachi off the reproduction market, a lot of what's on the market is going to be this, which is basically an uchigatana blade in terms of length and curvature stuck in Tachi-like fittings. Now, we're not going to talk about that. What we're going to focus on is something that at least has more of a Tachi-like, a more extreme, curvature. Now, a couple of benefits. I removed the Sageo from this. And this one does have that full diamond wrap, which is going to work for you and against you in certain ways. But what ashi tend to have for a Tachi, not a metal ring, but these leather loops. And we'll talk about how those actually work well in their intended application. But at least I don't have hard metal on that bottom one getting in the way of the things that the metal one did, right? Right? Well, okay. Let's start with that graceful insertion. I'm going to say it's actually a little bit harder because that leather really wants to catch on your obi. Once it's in there, though, not bad. Second problem, though, having that wrap there. There's friction. That will help keep the saya put after you draw, so it's not flopping around or rotating into any weird orientation that creates other challenges. So that's nice. It gives you something definitely really positive to grab onto. But you still have some restriction in your sayabiki. Now, I'm not getting so much interference in the sayabiki stroke, but I'm still getting some. That leather loop on the bottom gets on the wrong side of my obi. It's going to catch, and I'm not going to be able to pull the saya off. So that's going to be a problem. But otherwise, yes, I can make it work. But again, yeah, that was an edge-up draw. Rotating it, though, at least I don't have the ring, that longer metal ashi to get in my way. So yeah, I can get a little bit more rotation, but yeah, even then it caught on me. It's got corners, and that leather loop creates its own friction. So it can be problematic. If you're not ready for it, it's going to be a challenge. But what you see me demonstrating with here is a Tachi that has an uchigatana nagasa, 28 inches, 71 centimeters. What happens if we go for, okay, this one is, got to look at my notes to give you the metric as well as the imperial, 33 inches, 84 centimeters of nagasa blade length. All right, let me get this monster in my obi. And again, I'm going to have the same issue clearing that lower ashi loop. All right, now I've certainly described my short arms in many videos. Having the weapon this high up on my hip versus other options we're going to look at, well, obviously I'm restricted in my sayabiki because of that lower ashi, but I can clear it. But it's a hell of a stretch. It's pretty awkward. And yeah, does actually restrict some of the blade angles I can draw with it yet when I'm doing no-toe. Ooh. Not comfy. But what are your actual options for using the hangers as intended? Okay, bear with me. I'm trying to get the ideal angle for this. And yes, I am going to specifically use the longer Tachi to talk about how this thing works from its actual hangers. And of course, I know I'm going to get a lot of people chiming in, Mike, that's wrong. You're supposed to wear it from the Sageo. Yes, the Sageo should be tied through the loops, goes around your waist. But every time I've tried that, it really doesn't work for me. Why? I'm not wearing full armor. If I was wearing full armor, that skinny little cord is going to be over the top of an outer OB and a padded inner OB, and it's going to be between my do, my breastplate, and my haidate, my skirt armor. It's going to be very different. Now, unlike the Uchigatana, which can be easily taken on and off, I mean, this thing gets tied on and it's pretty much going to stay there. It's a pain in the butt to get it on and off. Now, I've ameliorated that problem somewhat by not using the Sageo. I'm just using a regular leather belt, but still, yeah, it's a fumble to get it on and off. It's not going to be graceful. But what you wind up with Tachi is, depending on where you adjust that attachment, it can be higher or lower on your hip depending on your preference. But it is going to be fixed pretty much horizontally. Doesn't really wiggle around a lot. But a couple of things you're getting out of this. By having it slightly lower on the hip, yes indeed, it does facilitate the drawing of a longer blade. But I do have to make some adjustments in my technique for no-toe to be able to find that saya and position it right. But then, a Tachi was never designed to be used like an Uchigatana. The Tachi predates the Uchigatana for battlefield use versus urban use as an everyday carry weapon that you're taking on and off and might need to draw in a hurry under threat. You might have to draw a battlefield weapon, but this is going to be your secondary, your backup weapon as compared to your longer range options. But hopefully you're still going to have a lot of room. Now the other thing you have to consider, traditionally speaking, the samurai is probably on horseback. So there's certain draws I'm not going to want to do because my horse's head's in the way. So probably more of an upward draw is going to be favored. Like a Western Saber, your first draw is going to be into a hanging guard or, well, preem. But can I use any other draws that I might be familiar with to kind of do a variation of Iaido Iaijutsu with it? Yeah, I can certainly just grab a hold of the thing, rotate it. Now my edge is facing sideways, and I can again do it anywhere in the draw depending on what I want to telegraph and not telegraph. So yeah, I can do a draw that comes out that way. And yeah, I can also potentially just rotate the thing all the way over edge up. But again, now that I've got the longer blade, that's a stretch. But again, having it just a little bit lower on my hip lets me do my no-toe without looking like I'm about to dislocate my shoulder. For our final chapter, what we're talking about is the Shin Gunto with the metal ring hangers suspended from a pair of straps that were designed for a Western-style saber. Now, arguably, a Western-style saber is probably going to have a longer blade than, well, this Shin Gunto. The blade length Nagasa is in the Uchigatana range in this case, so about 28 inches, 71 centimeters. So I don't need it this far down on my hip to clear the blade from the scabbard. But that also means I have plenty of room to clear the blade from the scabbard. And that makes it very freely maneuverable. It gives me lots and lots of options. But speaking of options, all right, let's go ahead and start with the structural ones. I could certainly adjust the length of the straps to have it higher or lower, and with this blade length I could have it significantly higher and it wouldn't be a problem. The ratio of the length between the front and the back strap determines how it hangs. In this case, you'll see it's at an angle, but more vertical than horizontal. If you were paying attention during the Tachi demonstration, that setup kept the sword very rigidly horizontal on my hip. Not a lot of play at all. And especially with the longer one moving around. Bangs into stuff, potentially. Wasn't a sword for walking around town with. But the other extreme, which we talked about with single hanger Shin Gunto, I found that if it's dangling too vertically, that creates other entanglement challenges for me. So having an angle somewhere in between those two for me was pretty ideal, and it is for many cultures who, hang their swords from some sort of frog or hanger system. But some other options I have here having this extra slack. Obviously, I have a lot of freedom of flexibility when I reach down here to rotate this saya into any angle during the draw, depending on how I want that draw stroke, that blade orientation to come out. And you've certainly seen me just reach down here and rotate it up into, well, kind of familiar uchigatana position so I can do my comfortable no-toe. No problem. But having longer straps like this also gives me one other possibility. I kind of get a little bit of something like sayabiki. What am I talking about? I could actually extend the saya forward, at least partially. So I get some of that effect of being able to peel the saya off the blade versus just pulling the blade out of the saya, which does indeed arguably speed up your draw stroke by, well, about a fraction of a second. So possibilities there. Now, is this traditional for Japanese style swordsmanship? No, not at all. But if you're someone like me who does a lot of cross-training across cultures and historical periods, this is a very interesting thing to try. I'm basically combining kenjutsu and iaido with, well, Western Saber. Speaking of which, fulfilling that first promise, more sword content. What I'm planning to do next is a series of comparison videos of various cold steel and then windlass sabers. So stay tuned for that. Until then, let's get our conversation going in the comments. If you have any questions, any other methods or equipment that you've used. But as always, thank you all so much for watching, liking the videos, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness. And I do hope to see you back for, yes, more sword content.